Millions of Syrian refugees have settled in Turkey over the past several years. They were initially welcomed, but now many locals are starting to resent their presence. I'm Femi Okay.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Tweet us your thoughts or join us live on YouTube.
Turkey hosts more refugees than any other country in the world. Most of them come from Syria, which has been fighting a civil war for the past 8 years. As Turkey's economy weakens, what was once a point of national pride is now a liability for the government. Officials find themselves under pressure as public anti-Syrian sentiment rises across the nation.
To handle overcrowding in Istanbul, Turkish authorities are planning to relocate thousands of Syrians into other cities, potentially separating them from their family members. The government has also reportedly been rounding up and deporting hundreds of Syrians over the past few months in violation of international law. Turkey denies this claim, saying it helps refugees and does not deport them. But Turkey can't host 3.6 million Syrians indefinitely, and refugees worry that their time in the country is running out. So to discuss these issues, joining us today, we have from Istanbul, Yusuf Iram. He is a political analyst for TRT World.
From Boston, Massachusetts, we welcome Sara Hunedi, a Syrian writer and human rights activist. She's also a refugee who lived in Turkey for 2 years.
And also speaking to us from Istanbul is Diego Cupolo, a freelance reporter and author of 7 Syrians, War Accounts from Syrian Refugees.
We also invited Turkish officials to join us, and we reached out to several of them, but they did not respond to us. But we are very grateful for you guests for being in this conversation. Yusuf, this idea of anti-Syrian sentiment, have you seen it? What does it look like in Turkey?
Well, obviously, it does exist anytime you have such a mass exodus of refugees and an injection of a minority immediately in such a small amount of time. We're talking about 3.6 million refugees, as you stated, and that's just the registered amount of refugees, and that's just Syrian refugees. When you add Afghans and Iraqis who have also fled with the off-the-books illegal amount, you're nearing 5 million. That's about 6-7% of the Turkish population. That's a tremendous amount of pressure on the social fabric of a country when that number is injected all in with the span of 3 to 4 years. So, yeah, there could be a little negative sentiment amongst the public, and it's very understandable. This is human nature. But the Turks are very, very tolerant, and if we saw this type of mass entrance of refugees into another country, a Western country, a European country, the United States, for example, even, I'm sure there would be much more dire circumstances amongst the refugees and a much greater backlash amongst the public.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of that sentiment, I wanted to share this from Twitter, someone who says this is a super contentious topic in Turkey. And I need to inform you as a Turk, there is more than meets the eye. Not every single one of the millions of Syrian refugees welcomed to Turkey are allowed to go all to Istanbul. That is the rule. Refugees are distributed. He goes on, tweeting to the stream, to say, I am wary of reports a handful of Syrians are sent back to active war zones without qualifying each case, where and why they were sent back. I'm wary of the matter becoming a domestic political football, and I'm wary the rest of the world is not doing enough. So, Sara, I'll give this one to you because there was a point where you were in Istanbul as a Syrian refugee. Talk to us about how you saw this issue, what this person on Twitter describes as very contentious. How was it for you?
Well, I was there in 2014, around the beginning and the summer. And back then we were kind of new in Turkey. You know, it was still the wave of migration towards EU was still new as well. And everything was it was more of a welcoming atmosphere at the time. Of course, there's no black and white. Of course, there was a lot of people who were struggling, you know, to make ends meet. But for me, I was in between jobs and trying to find education, like many people my age at the time. And I actually ended up, I couldn't stay in Istanbul because you have to understand that people who are in Istanbul, who are people who work in factories, or they are able to go to college in Istanbul and afford living expenses there. And for me at the time, I couldn't. So I moved to the Syrian-Turkish borders in Gaziantep, and I ended up working there.
Yes, I want to play you a little clip. This is a Turkish baker. He's a local, and he was talking about jobs and also refugees. Have a listen to him. This was just a few weeks ago.
I myself, for example, am a baker. Because foreigners live in my country, I cannot easily find a job in my sector. Before 2012, there were probably 100 bakeries looking for bakers, through online ads as well. Now, the bakers in our country are looking for work. Whichever bakery you go to, it's Uzbeks, Turkmens, Syrians, Afghans. They should go back to their countries as soon as possible.
Diego, that is an understandable opinion if you are struggling, if you notice that your profession is being pressurized by other people coming into your neighborhood. When I asked Yusuf, what does anti-Syrian sentiment look like, he kind of bypassed it a little bit. He didn't really explain what it might look like. But you spend a lot of time with Syrian refugees. What is their experience as you report to you?
Yeah, so I think the man in that clip was referring to illegal workers who are paid less than Turkish citizens and would be more attractive hires for Turkish companies looking to save on low-skilled labor. The fact is that most of the Syrians in Turkey do not have work permits. The work permit initiative has failed. About 65,000 Syrians have work permits. That was the figure at the end of 2018. And there's 3.6 million Syrians in Turkey, so that's a really small number. So if you have this scenario where you have very cheap labor and you have an economic crisis which is ongoing in Turkey, some people might feel like Syrians are being unjustly preferred by people looking for that low-skilled labor. I would also add that the last few years have been very difficult in Turkey. There's been a lot of elections, a lot of violence. There was a difficult period in 2016. The country's been through a lot, so people are emotionally riled at the moment. And with the economic downturn, Syrians and cheap labor has become an easy target to vent for many people here. So that translates into comments like what you just saw, and sometimes more indirect discrimination, or just looks or comments in the streets that might make people feel unwelcome. But I would just say what's been said so far is 100% true, and it's difficult to host this number of people in any country.
Mm-hmm. So the balance of those two things, that resentment and yet the responsibility of hosting that many people, is being represented online. I wanted to share this from Ridwan on Twitter, who says the current situation of 3 million former Syrian refugees in Turkey are at the blink of a social catastrophe. I hear terrible things about refugees from my town, which is a small town in West Turkey. As the economy is bankrupting, a social enmity is growing against refugees. So he's linking the idea of the worsening economy in with that. And that's a point that others have picked up on. And so I wanted to play this, a video comment we got from Salim Sazak. He's a PhD candidate at Brown University. Yusuf, I'll direct this to you. Have a listen.
The refugee crisis has already cost the country over $40 billion, which has become extremely controversial as the country's economic troubles worsen. And polls show overwhelming cross-partisan support for an end to the open door policy and gradual repatriation of Syrian refugees. If Ankara is indeed keen on continuing its open door policy, it will have to do it against impossibly difficult odds, against a wave of public opposition, and that's going to create lots of political controversy.
What role is the economy playing in this, Yusuf?
It's playing a huge role in the increase in negative sentiment towards the refugees. And it's only natural when the economy is in a downturn that people are looking for someone to blame. And refugees are an ideal target. We saw refugees as a huge target during local elections, as some of the nationalist parties and the major opposition used it as part of their election campaign, and it was very, very successful. They were able to capture Istanbul, they were able to capture Ankara, and after the elections, it looks like the ruling party got the message. It does have to deal with this refugee problem. And we are now seeing the president slowly attempting to find solutions to this refugee problem. The major solution that he sees is a repatriation, but you can't just dump these refugees back into a war zone. So Turkey's trying to sit down at the table with Russia and secure a ceasefire in Idlib. They're trying to talk to the Americans, secure a safe zone in northeast Syria, trying to find areas where they can secure and bring refugees back. And when we also talk about the 3.5 million refugees in Turkey, we also need to remember the internally displaced people living in areas that Turkey is present and Turkey has influence in Syria as well. When you take that number into account, we're talking about another 6 million people in the Euphrates Shield Zone and the Operation Olive Branch Zone, which encompasses Afrin, Azaz, Jarablus, Al-Bab, all these areas. So you have Turkey responsible for almost 9 million Syrians right now. This is an absurd number. We're talking about 30% of the pre-conflict Syrian population.
I want to share a story, and it's a foreign policy story that you, Zara, worked on. It's a question of semantics, maybe, or maybe practicalities. Yusuf is saying repatriation, and in this foreign policy article here, right here on my laptop, you call it deportation policy. There's a difference here in the way you are seeing this issue. Explain.
Well, it's not really too complicated. What I have seen is that there has been a large number of Syrians being deported against their will from Turkey, which breaks several laws, international laws and human rights laws. So, and I know people, and I lived in Turkey, and I left it about 3 to 4 years ago, and I still have a lot of connections there, and it really pains me to see people who have recently stopped feeling safe in Turkey, even though they sought refuge there. So I mentioned two people in the article. I mentioned Hisham and Muhammad and Hani Hilal, and both of them were deported around the same time. One of them was killed while trying to re-enter Turkey. His name is Hisham and Muhammad. I really don't want his name to be forgotten because he was a young man and he had 3 kids. And it's really not fair to see how Turkish police on the borders have treated this man while he was trying to re-enter in many times during that month that he was deported. And if you're going to deport people back, at least deport them somewhere safe. And we all know that Syria right now is nothing but safe. So, and Hani Hilal right now is still stuck, and I talk to him on a daily basis. He's still stuck in northern Syria, and he is in hiding because he has been critical of the HDC, and before, when he was in Syria, he has been critical of al-Nusra, and unlike many maybe fighters who are right now still fighting in Syria, he believes in democracy and human rights, and unfortunately that puts him in great danger. So the reason why I called it a deportation policy is because of those stories that I have been hearing. And they have been forced to sign either deportation papers, or they have been forced and found themselves on the Syrian-Turkish borders being deported to a war zone. So that's why I called it that. Mm-hmm.
Understandable from some members of our community. Inez here writes in his frustration with this, and he says Turkey should prompt European states to take on responsibility, because unless Turkey manages the mass refugee influx from Syria, the most aggrieved side within this process will be European countries. Diego, your take on what the EU's role in all of this has been, should be, is?
Well, that's a question a lot of people are asking themselves. The EU gave or made a deal with Turkey. It's a migration flow that we saw in 2015 and 2016 when there was large amounts of people crossing on boats to Greece and also overland to Bulgaria. So we saw that deal stem a lot of that flow. It continues in a bit of a trickle form. But regarding what the responsibility is for European states, they fund some of these removal centers according to an Atlantic article that was published today. There's a lot of EU money going to Turkey to take care of Syrians that remain here. EU funding helps Syrians access education, access food funds, and also take care of their medical needs. A lot of EU funding goes to hospitals for Syrians and other migrants in Turkey. So the EU, in theory, has a lot of leverage when it comes to dealing with the situation, but at the same time, many officials are, they find it difficult to speak out or criticize Turkey because, again, Turkey is taking the brunt of the situation and they don't want to upset anyone and cause another migration flow, especially now that we see advances in Idlib and there could be more Syrians crossing the border into Turkey. So there's this kind of tension where everybody is trying to do their best, and then unfortunately you have these deportation stories which are rising more and more in the news. And I wish I had the answer for your question, but that's the best I can do.
I completely disagree with Diego, especially on the funds. I mean, Turkey has spent about $37 billion. This is UN data. And the EU has paid out, I believe, $2.2 billion of the $6 billion that they promised in the migrant deal, which is comical. I mean, comical. Why is Turkey shouldering the financial burden? Turkey's not a rich country. You have many rich European countries that could help out, since seeing as they're not doing anything to take care of these refugees, the least they can do is provide more financial support. The other promises made in the migrant deal have also not been kept. They had promised Turkey visa-free travel for Turkish citizens. That was another unkept promise, but especially the financial aspect right now is with the country going through an economic downturn, it could really use some EU support. It could use some support from the United States. I mean, we see America spending $5 billion on a wall. That $5 billion would be a lot better spent given to Turkey to take care of some of these Syrian refugees. And Turkey does need money, taking care of refugees, providing medical services, education services, food. This all costs money. And this is money that Turkey right now does not have. And it desperately does need to continue providing these services for refugees. Now, Angela Merkel just earlier today, I just read that she had talked with President Erdogan, and also the Greek leader Mitsotakis had also expressed concern in that they were thinking about helping to speed up the implementation of the EU migrant deal. So it seems that they're slowly starting to see the danger arising in Idlib, because a collapse in Idlib could bring another 1 to 2 million refugees on Turkey's door.
Yusuf.
I don't think Turkey can handle it.
Yusuf, it's obvious from this conversation, this is a very nuanced conversation. There is so much that Turkey is doing. There is rising criticism with what they're doing. And amidst that, an ad campaign to try and get Turkish locals to see what the contribution refugees can make to their society. Have a look at this, it's fascinating.
انضرب البيت، بيتنا انضرب. لما انضرب البيت ما ضل عنا شيء. قلت له لجوزي انه انا بدي اطلع على تركيا حتى لو بدي اعيش تحت شجره، المهم بدي احمي اولادي. هلا خيالي كأم أحلامي إني أشوف أولادي في أعلى المراتب يعني. أما كامرأة يعني بحب يكون هيك إلي بسمة.
Powerful ad campaign there, but underlying it all are these very strong sentiments. And I want to give you a taste of two. One on YouTube, this is Emre, who says there is negative sentiment towards Europe in Istanbul and in Turkey and other external powers, because a lot of people feel that Turkey is doing Europe's dirty work. So that's on one hand. On the other, someone else writing on YouTube, John, who says, well, the same problems are happening in Europe, especially in Germany. Many people in Germany don't understand why Syrians don't go home to rebuild their own country. So when we talk about going home, we actually spoke to someone who sent us a video comment. And Sara, you know him well because he was actually the co-author of that foreign policy piece you wrote. This is Karim, and here is his explanation for the options that Syrians have.
There's a notion that we're hearing more frequently that Syria is now safe for return for refugees. At least most of it is. And this couldn't be further from the truth. Factoring that Idlib is still under heavy Russian, Syrian airstrikes and shelling, and that it is ruled by a brutal organization called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, there is also cases of Syrian state repression as well. Many areas that have been reclaimed by the Syrian government, including East Aleppo, which took place over a year ago, well over a year ago actually, that the return of basic services that many Syrians rely on haven't returned. This includes electricity and other social services. These are questions that have not been responded to or addressed, and these are also issues that have not been clarified. So it gets very complicated for Syrian refugees.
So Sara, how do we go about clarifying those questions that Karim mentioned?
Well, as we were talking previously, the refugee problem is not just a humanitarian problem, it's also a political one. So Assad is still in power, backed by Russia and Iran. And we've seen how when you asked, do other countries bear responsibility? Of course they do, and in both arenas, in humanitarian and in political arenas. And it's really important to stress that because yes, on the Syrian front, we could not build a cohesive opposition due to a lot of donor fatigue and a lot of problems within our community. But at the same time, there's a huge responsibility on the international world because it is seeing the atrocities that is happening to us, and it's still refusing to act on it. And we've seen many red lines have been crossed, and it's fine to the world. We've seen, I just really, when it all boils up to all the political science that I do, the analysis, it all goes to waste when I hear about how many people are being killed.
Sara, let me put this to you. This is really important. We quoted your article from the Foreign Policy magazine. A comment in Foreign Policy following your article not so long after that from the Presidential Communications Director. This is a challenge for you and people like you. Instead of assigning blame to those who are not at fault, governments and human rights organisations should be promoting international cooperation to find a political solution. What solutions do you have?
Well, it's really hard for us to talk about political solution right now because we Syrians have been calling for a political solution since 2011 when we started the revolution and it turned into a war. We really needed the support in 2013. And I hate to be the person who's like, it's too late now because it's really, it's...
But is that what you're saying, Sara? Are you saying it's too late?
I'm saying that we've lost a lot of people. And I'm saying that as long as the world keep looking at us as numbers and not as people who are demanding, who have demands, who have a policy or a vision for a country that we're trying to build, it's not going to be solved because right now our war is not the people against the government. It's now the whole world, including Russia and Iran and the US and Turkey. So that's also another problem.
Sara, very sobering words there as we wrap up our conversation. Sara and Yusuf and Diego, thank you very much for joining us on the stream today. Malika?
I will end with this from Twitter. It would be unfair on Turkey's part to be single-handedly hosting 1 million Syrians. 3.6 million is not a small number, but keeping the war in mind, I believe Turkey should continue its open door policy.
Thank you for all of your comments. We continue online as always. Malika and I are on Twitter @AJStream. Thank you, guests. See you next time.